Good afternoon. This is Jill Paperno, and I am the current Monroe County Bar Association president, and I have the honor and privilege of interviewing June Castellano today on March 17th. So happy St. Patrick's Day. And let me start out by asking you, June, what kind of law do you practice?
I have a family law practice. I do get involved in some other matters, sometimes involving surrogates court as well, involving guardian ad litem work, and also involving guardianship work as well. But for the most part, it's a family law practice. And I'm pleased to say that it's been 22 years that I've been in practice in my own firm. Before that, I was in legal services and worked at what was then called Greater Upstate Law Project and now is Empire. Justice, yes.
I remember we used to call it Gulp.
That is exactly what we used to call it. That's what it was known as, and it was a statewide legal services entity. And I primarily practiced family law there, but also did some welfare law work. But now my practice is primarily divorce, child support, custody, and also some domestic violence work. I had done a lot of that when I was in legal services, did a lot of outreach and working with community groups and statewide groups around that, that area, and continue still to do some of that work. So as well as, I wanted to just add, I also, because I always like to put a plug in for this, for other attorneys out there, I do attorney for the child work, which in the old days we called law guardian work. And I think it's very important for attorneys, especially those who are experienced in family law, to continue to do some of that. It's an area that I think is undervalued in the profession, but there's a lot of very good work that can be done by attorneys for the children.
So for those who don't know what that is, can you explain a little bit about what attorney for the child work is?
Of course. So when parents go to court, they're the parties, the children are not. However, very often the children's needs, the children's wishes really need to be included in any conversation that takes place at the courthouse. The role of the attorney for the child is to be that voice so that the child does not have to be the one to end up going to court. And the attorney for the child represents the child as he or she would do for any party. The child has a position, then the attorney for the child advocates that position, but also can serve as a broker, if you will, to facilitate settlements and to prevent the need to actually have a full-blown trial.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears now and ask you how you first became involved with the Monroe County Bar Association.
Well, it was a very long time ago, but I can certainly say that I did it willingly, and it had a happy ending. I'm still involved. So back in the early 80s, when I started practicing law and when I first came to Rochester, one of my supervisors suggested to me that I become involved in the Monroe County Bar Association. And I probably said, "What's that?" Because I had never been a member of any bar association. I was a newly admitted attorney. And he said to me, and I remember this to this day, "It's not a march and chowder group." Now, I didn't even know what a march and chowder group was, but what he meant by that was, this is not an organization that just goes on parades, you know, for Memorial Day, for Labor Day, whatever it is going to be, and has summer picnics. This is actually a group that does things and advocates on issues and has collegiality and professionalism and encourages all of that within the profession. So I sent my dues in. I think my organization actually paid for my dues, and the rest is kind of history.
And so you did that initially with the suggestion of a colleague. And what led you to stay involved with the Monroe County Bar Association?
Well, I started to do committee work. And as with any organization, if all you do is read the monthly newsletter or scan a few emails, you're not forming a connection. It's very important that in order for you to get something out of an organization and to contribute to an organization, because it's a two-way street and it's duly gratifying both ways, you need to become involved. So I became involved in committee work that had to do with my practice, committee work that had to do with the profession, and eventually started to do more and more work and started to become active in leadership roles within committees. So for example, back in the 90s, I guess it was, early 90s, we had fee arbitration coming into our profession, mandatory fee arbitration, especially initially with matrimonial cases. And that was related, of course, to my practice. So I became involved in the fee arbitration committee and became more and more involved till eventually I did chair that. In fact, I'll never forget, I had scheduled a meeting on September 11th, 2001. And I don't know what I was thinking, but the meeting was at noon, and obviously the horrible events of that day had taken place earlier in the morning. And we actually were holding the meeting at the bar center until we all looked around and said, we shouldn't be here. So yes, there are some moments that I have to say correspond with history through that we remember where we were at certain times, don't we? But I did get involved that way through starting with committees, starting with section, family law section, and then eventually having some leadership roles as well.
And speaking of leadership, what year were you president?
I was president from 2003 to 2004. Of course, as you know, it's a middle of the year to middle of the year term. So from June until June of 2003 to 2004.
And did the board have a particular focus during the year that you were president?
There wasn't any one particular item that jumped out at me and that I can recall. One of the things that we did begin that year, really planted the seeds for and started to really work up as a viable idea, was to push for the co-location of the legal services providers within one building, which of course now we know as the Teleska Center for Justice. So that was a project that got off the ground during my year. And I remember being involved in many meetings and discussing it and pushing it. And of course, with my background as a former legal services attorney, I thought it was a terrific idea, still think it's a terrific idea. I'm very glad to see that it's still in existence.
We've maintained the relationships, even though physically we had to move, but we've had the,
of course.
And that's one of the really interesting things about the Bar Association, I think, is that it's got this connection to the legal services providers at the Teleska Center and has maintained those very closely.
Yes.
Yeah. So in addition to that, can you describe some of the highlights of your year?
Well, one highlight that felt so good when it happened and still feels so good was the Law Day celebration we had. Now, every year, Law Day has a theme, and the American Bar Association gives us the theme. That year, 2004, it was the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education desegregation case, landmark case. And we had the ability to, and privilege, to have as our keynote speaker that year, Clyde Bailey Sr., who was patent counsel for Kodak and also president of the National Bar Association, prominent African-American Bar Association in the country. And he gave remarkable keynote a remarkable keynote address. And we, as in most years that I know of, we co-sponsored that with the Greater Rochester Association for Women Attorneys, as well as the Rochester Black Bar Association. And I'll never forget looking out at the audience that year, and it was more integrated than I had ever seen a bar association event. That was up until then. And that gave me such a good feeling. And again, the remarks that he made in terms of, you know, pulling together all of the history, pulling together where we're going as a country, introducing the concept of the browning of America. And all of that was 2004. And so much of what he talked about, we now have coming to pass. And in the history of racism, current problems we have with racism, it's also relevant. And that, I think I didn't even realize in 2004 how relevant it was going to be for 2021. Sadly, unfortunately, as you may know, Mr. Bailey passed away untimely in 2005. But that was really a highlight from my year. I must say I enjoyed everything that I did, pretty much everything, I think. I really liked being an ambassador for the Bar Association in the community. I was trying to have as my platform that year to promote a positive perception of lawyers within the community, and in writing and in some public speaking with community groups and so on. And the other thing that I really enjoyed that year, I don't know that I would call it a highlight, and maybe some people might, was the writing that I did, the articles that I did. I really enjoyed doing those for the Daily Record and also for Views. And I remember the one that I did for example, for Law Day in Brown versus Board of Education. I researched it, I had citations, I did all sorts of things. And it just felt really good to be even looking in areas that I didn't necessarily practice in.
Yeah, it sounds like you used the opportunity of being the president to really speak on important issues and address things that were upcoming. And it's one of the wonderful opportunities that a bar president does have. So
you're absolutely right. We have more opportunities with that position than we realize. And over the years, some folks have come to me and said, "Gee, I've been nominated. Should I do it?" And absolutely 100% of the time, I have said to these individuals, "Of course you should. You will not regret it. It gives you such an opportunity to speak on behalf of the profession that you should never say no." But I've been called a bar junkie, so maybe I have a different frame of reference.
When you say you've been called a bar junkie, you know, when you are bar president, then your immediate past president, you were president-elect, there comes a point where those roles come to an end, the immediate past president piece. And then some people make choices to stay very involved or to step back a little bit, but you say you're a bar junkie. So what makes you a bar junkie?
I have a hard time saying no. With respect to bar associations, it's not just MCBA. I was past president of GRAWA and still remains somewhat involved with GRAWA. And I became much more involved with the New York State Bar Association. After my term as MCBA president, I served as the vice president for this judicial district, 7th Judicial District. And continued, I had served previously on the House of Delegates, served, of course, during my MCBA tenure on the House, because that's part of the job as president, to be part of the delegation to the State Bar. And then after that, served another term as I think maybe 2 terms, I'm not sure, and continued to serve off and on, currently on the nominating committee for the State Bar. And most recently, I co-chair a task force for the State Bar that was created by then President-elect Scott Carson last March. So it's been a year even though he told me it would only be 6 months. And it's the Emergency Task Force on Solo and Small Firm, for solo and small firm practitioners due to the pandemic and the issues that solos and small firms are facing. And where we will be putting out our report in time for, we're forecasting for the June House of Delegates meeting. And our report isn't going to be a summary of what we've done. We're calling it a pandemic blueprint. It's going to include a compilation of what has happened, what are the best practices, what is some advice for the future, and it's a report that we are billing as we want it to sit on the shelves and collect dust. We don't want anyone to ever have to read this thing. But if they do, it's there.
Again, it's something that's forward-looking in a way we don't want to have to look forward to that, but we've certainly learned we have to be prepared for things that we weren't prepared for.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch gears again a little bit and ask you what it was like to be a woman practicing law in the field when you first started.
Well, I can give you one example related to MCBA. So early 80s, I would go to some events and I'd be the only woman in the room. And that's unheard of now. I mean, that's so different than what we are experiencing now. I would go to court and I'd be the only woman in the room. Again, so unheard of. So feeling of aloneness, I suppose, that's one thing that's different. I did participate in a project that GRAWA did to put together some vignettes for a gender fairness project. This is also going back decades now. And one of those vignettes was based on an experience that I had in the courtroom where other male attorneys had been very forceful in their arguments with motion practice. And I get up and the judge is telling me, sit down, you sit down. And I'm thinking, I don't think I'm doing anything different than what I've seen. And afterwards, the opposing counsel came up to me and said, wow, you were a real tiger. And I'm thinking, what did I do that was different than what I've just seen? And of course, would see over and over and over again, particularly in the area of divorce and family law, where you get to see some drama sometimes. So there are definitely certain things that are in our past, and there are still some things that are in our present, I should say, in our present, committed in our presence during the present. But I think the number of women who are practicing now and the number of women who we see visibly within the profession in terms of judges, in terms of court clerks, in terms of court personnel, that is definitely different than the early 80s.
And while you were bar president, did you feel like being a woman bar president, that was any different than the male bar presidents you'd interacted with or their experiences?
I don't think so, no. I can't think of any one incident that made me feel uncomfortable due to gender difference of any kind. I think by that point, I believe, if I recall correctly, I think I was the 5th female president. And I think by that point, there had been, the tracks had been laid, the groundwork had been laid, and it was no longer something that was perhaps novel, not to suggest that that should be considered novel at all.
So do you have any advice for younger women attorneys now?
My advice would be to realize your history, to realize that what you're seeing now, the way that the courts look, the way that the profession looks, the way that the practice feels, is not what it always has been. And one of the problems that unfortunately is something that is out there is that history is capable of repeating itself, and we can't be complacent. We have to be alert to situations where there can be discrimination. We can't approach any profession with the idea that there can never be discrimination anymore. There can never be an attempt to get ahead by putting someone else down because of their differences. So I would say be aware of history. Don't be complacent. Don't take where you are now for granted. Look for where there can still be improvement, because there can always be improvement. We're human beings. So those are, I think, pieces of advice, if I could give anybody advice, that I would give to those coming up in the profession.
I think that's great advice for all of us. So is there anything else you'd like to share about your experience as bar president or in your field before we wrap up?
I think you've covered quite a bit already, and I certainly wouldn't want to bore anybody looking at this video, but I will say one more thing, which is perhaps funny, perhaps not. In trying to remember 2003, it was a long time ago, right? I did take a look at some of the archived items I have on my hard drive that have survived these years from one PC to another. And I stumbled across the text of my installation speech from 2003. And one of the things that it said was that I was challenging people to recognize that law is a profession, it's a calling, and it's something that we should embrace and be happy we're doing. And I actually had this quote, which I guess I said to the whole group, I am a happy lawyer. And it really took me by surprise. I'm like, really? I was a happy lawyer? Well, I guess I'm still a happy lawyer. I had to stop and think, am I still a happy lawyer? But it was energizing reading what I said back in 2003.
Well, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
I really appreciate the time you spent, and I thank you for what you've done with the Bar Association, and we'll be seeing you, if not in person in the near future, on Zoom at our meetings and other events.
I certainly hope in person. Yes, and stay well.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.